Hello everyone. We are here to discuss about the questions that UPSC has asked in GS paper 3 related to topics like environment and ecology and disaster management. Right. So if you see GS paper 3, you will find that total 4 questions have been asked by UPSC from environment, ecology and disaster management. Right. So 4 questions are question number 7, question number 8, and then question number 17 and question number 18. So these 4 questions are there. We will be discussing about these questions. So we can say that roughly the weightage of environment, ecology and disaster management combined is 50 marks. And if you see the questions, this time it's very difficult to segregate these two subjects, right? Because the topics on which questions have been asked are very much related to both the topics, right? It's not that environment and ecology they have segregated and then asked the questions, and then there are questions from disaster management. More or less you can say that the topics are combined, right? So let's go through the questions related to environment, ecology and disaster management. First question is the question number 7 that we are discussing here. So question is, discuss how the contradiction between rapid infrastructure development and disaster risk reduction in ecologically sensitive areas of India can be managed with suitable examples, right? So in this particular question we are supposed to discuss the age old dilemma that we have in front of us, and that is how to balance development and environment. And in this case, when we talk about balance between development and environment, we have to take into account the disasters that occur in the environment, right? So how to balance development on one hand, and on the other hand, how to make sure that development does not increase the disaster related risk of that particular area. Right, so that is what is the question is asking. How exactly we will be able to address this contradiction, which often is seen when we carry out rapid infrastructure development. When we carry out rapid infrastructure development, then the vulnerability of that area to the occurrence of disaster increases. Right, for example, the disaster that occurred in Wayanad in 2024 was not, let's say, an isolated event, right? You must be aware of landslide that we have seen in Wayanad in 2024. That was the result of unplanned development that is being carried out in that fragile area of Western Ghats. Similarly, you must be aware that these days there are increased instances of landslides in Himalayas, be it Western Himalayas or Eastern Himalayas. We are able to see more instances of landslide. So landslide is what? It is a disaster. So the risk of Western as well as Eastern Himalayas towards landslide has increased. And that is directly the result of infrastructure that we are developing in this area. Right, you must be aware in Himalayas road connectivity especially is increased, and that road connectivity, which is nothing but a kind of infrastructure, is making the area prone to a disaster like landslide. Now this contradiction we are seeing in different ecologically sensitive areas of India, right? Be it Himalayas, be it Western Ghats, be it our coastal regions. Right, in the coastal development, often we are able to see coastal erosion, and due to that coastal erosion, the coastal area is getting more and more vulnerable to the events like cyclones, tsunami, etc. And that's why there is a real contradiction that we are able to see, that yes, infrastructure which ideally is to make life of people easy and better is making life miserable, because due to that infrastructure development there are increased chances of the occurrence of disaster. And UPSC is asking you how exactly we can balance this particular contradiction, we can address this particular contradiction. And when we write this particular answer, we have to give suitable examples as well. right? So this question is for 150 words, that means for 10 marks. So in introduction, what you can write in this particular case, right? You should directly see, as you have only limited words, you should directly let's say address the demand of the question, right? So in introduction you can highlight that by carrying out locally sensitive development, by carrying out locally sensitive development and by ensuring climate resilient planning, we can balance the contradiction between the rapid infrastructure development and disaster risks due to that infrastructure, right? So you have addressed the demand of the question when you write these things. What we need that kind of development, that kind of infrastructure development which is as per the local needs, right? You must have heard about the Char Dham road project. In Char Dham road project, they say that the developmental, the road infrastructure technique that is used for plain area is being used for the development of roads in mountainous or hilly areas. Now, obviously, if that kind of technique is being used, obviously it will increase the disaster risk, right? And that's why what we need locally sensitive development. Locally sensitive development means we are taking into account the terrain of that particular area, we are taking into account the topography of that particular area, right? When we do that, we will be able to make sure that the infrastructure is more more, let's say, developed as per the area in which that infrastructure has been developed, right? We cannot have one size fits all approach when we carry out infrastructure development. Infrastructure has to be locally sensitive. That you should be writing in introduction. And then we need climate resilient planning, right? Whenever we, obviously, planning of infrastructure, right? Whenever we carry out infrastructure development, that infrastructure should not only be locally sensitive, that infrastructure should also be climate resilient infrastructure. That means it should be able to withstand the disasters to which that particular area is prone to, right? For example, suppose that area is prone to the disasters like floods, then we should have the development in such a way that there is enough space available for the water to flow from that particular infrastructure. That infrastructure should not lead to creation of what is called as backwater effect. If backwater effect is created, then the impact of flooding increases. So to avoid that, we should have enough space, we should have, let's say, the design of that infrastructure which will allow the water to flow from that particular area. Okay, so with these two terms you can start writing your answer, right? Then now in the body part, what exactly we can incorporate? In body part, if we want to address this particular contradiction, what we need to let's say write, firstly, see, there are some ecologically sensitive areas. I'm not saying all ecologically sensitive area will have this kind of let's say part, but a part of ecologically sensitive area should be a no-go zone, for development, right? So first, no-go zone for development. Now, when we say that that part should be no-go zone for development, that means we are saying that in that particular area which is highly sensitive, right? In ecologically sensitive area, there can be some part which will be highly fragile. In that part, we should avoid carrying out development, right? In that area, there should be no infrastructure development. Why? Because that is more fragile to the occurrence of disasters, right? We'll have to map that area, and then we'll have to ensure that in that area there is no development that is being carried out. No-go zone. It should be a no-go zone for infrastructure development first. Secondly, when we carry out development in other parts of let's say that eco-sensitive area, then we should factor in carrying capacity. Carrying capacity should be factored in. should be factored in, right? So for example, no-go zone, highly mountainous regions, right? Mountains which have very fragile, let's say, part, in that area we should have no-go zone. For example, in Himalayas we may have mountains which are extremely fragile. In those areas, no-go zone should be there. Similarly, in coastal areas, there can be, let's say, pristine mangrove forests that we have. That should be no-go zone, because if we cut down mangroves and if we carry out construction there, then the disaster vulnerability of that area is getting increased. So that area should be no-go zone, right? So examples can be higher mountainous regions of Himalayas. Secondly, coastal regions which have pristine mangrove forest, right? Then carrying capacity should be factored in when we carry out development, right? If we, let's say, factored in the carrying capacity of that area to carry out development, then the development becomes more region centric development, and that development will ensure that disaster risk of that area is kept under check, right? If we want to keep the disaster risk of that area under check, we will have to take into carrying capacity of that area, right? And this is especially true for Himalayan regions. This is especially true in Himalayan regions, because in Himalayan regions we are promoting, let's say, tourism, be it, let's say, in the form of pilgrimage or other tourism, other form of tourism. But tourism is being promoted, right? So for tourism, we are carrying out infrastructure development. As a result of that infrastructure development, more number of people are able to come in that area, and that area may get overwhelmed. That area might not have enough resources to, let's say, address the needs of that particular extra people that have came in that area because of the infrastructure development. So whenever infrastructure development is being carried out, be it in the form of roads, be it in the form of houses, resorts, anything, we have to take into account carrying capacity, right? So that should be done in these areas. Thirdly, engineering practices should be locally sensitive. Engineering practices should be locally sensitive, right? For example, suppose we are carrying out construction of some bridge in northeastern states. In northeastern states, rivers are mighty rivers. They have huge volume of water. So if we block a flow of river in let's say northeast states, then it increases the chance of flooding in that particular area. So to avoid this, what we will have to do, we'll have to take into account the natural flow of that particular river, and then we will have to design our infrastructure accordingly. If we do that, then we can say that the infrastructure is being developed in locally sensitive manner, right? So here you can write northeastern states. If we want to reduce the floods intensity in northeastern states, then the engineering practices, then the design of that particular infrastructure should take into account the natural factors in that particular area. For example, the flow of rivers. Infrastructure should be in such a way that it should not block the flow of rivers, right? So that can be the third point that we can write. Then the next point is disaster resilient infrastructure, right? The infrastructure that we construct should be disaster resilient infrastructure. When we say disaster resilient infrastructure, we are saying that that infrastructure should be able to withstand in that particular disaster, right? For example, it is not the earthquake that kills, it is the infrastructure built in that earthquake prone area that kills. And that's why that infrastructure should be earthquake resilient infrastructure. Let's consider that we know that in India, especially the Himalayan states and the northeastern states, along with the part of, let's say, Kutch region of Gujarat, is vulnerable to the occurrence of higher magnitude of earthquake, So in that area, whenever we carry out development, the designs of the infrastructure should be in such a way that it has factored in the earthquake vulnerability of that area. Right? Suppose that area is vulnerable to the earthquake of 7 to 8 Richter scale earthquake, then the infrastructure should be built in that way only. We should avoid high rise building in these kind of areas. When we do that, we say that infrastructure is disaster resilient infrastructure. This is especially true for earthquake prone areas of India, right, which includes Gujarat, which includes Himalayan states, which includes northeastern states as well. Right? So when we factor in these disaster risks, we will be able to appreciate that the infrastructure is built in that way only. Right? Then detailed EIA should be carried out. Right? Detailed EIA. Right? See, this is the topic in your syllabus, EIA. But what happens? Try to understand this point. See, whenever we carry out the process of EIA, often, yes, Rutvi, yes, EIA is an important aspect, right? So when we carry out EIA, try to understand EIA is the process that is related to a particular project, right? So it might be the case when we carry out EIA, we focus on that particular project, but we will have to go beyond project specific EIA. We'll have to take into account the entire region, right? Suppose in that region we have carried out 5 infrastructure projects. Individually those infrastructure projects might not be hurting that particular area, but collectively those 5 infrastructure projects may be hurting that area. And that's why whenever we carry out EIA, that EIA should be detailed EIA, which is beyond project specific and region specific EIA, right? So these aspects can be helpful for us to make sure that the disaster risk is reduced. Then we should also ensure that eco DRR factors are protected when infrastructure is developed. Eco DRR factors are protected. What do we mean by that? For example, eco DRR means ecology based disaster risk reduction. Can we say that mangroves, can we say that sandbanks act as a kind of shield for the coastal areas against the cyclonic surges, tsunami surges? Yes. So whenever we carry out infrastructure development in this, let's say, coastal area, then in this coastal area, we should protect these mangroves, we should protect these sandbanks. What will happen as a result of this? As a result of this, we will be able to ensure that a shield is intact, and that's why the disaster risk of that particular area we will be able to reduce, right? So that is also an important point. And lastly we can say that so these are, see, let me tell you one point after this last point. So last is incorporation of traditional knowledge. Right? When we carry out infrastructure development, we should incorporate traditional knowledge, and this is especially true for Andaman and Nicobar Islands, right? Because the traditional communities in that particular area have a repository of traditional knowledge. That traditional knowledge we should factor in whenever we want to carry out, let's say, the Great Nicobar project, right? Because that Great Nicobar project, which is an infrastructure project, should not harm that area by carrying out construction activities which are not, let's say, native to this particular area, right? So traditional knowledge should also be factored in. Clear? Okay, I hope you are able to understand this I hope you are able to understand this. Radhe Radhe Sejal. Clear? Fine. So these points, these aspects, if we incorporate, we will be able to solve this dilemma of infrastructure development, rapid infrastructure development, and increasing disaster risk of that area, right? So that way you can write. And then conclusion. In conclusion, we can say that with these kind of approaches, we can say that infrastructure can remain, with these kind of approaches, infrastructure can remain a tool for development, and it will not a means of disaster risk. And not a means of disaster risk, right? So if we follow this kind of approach, then we will be able to make sure that infrastructure remains as a tool for the development, right? Why we carry out infrastructure development? Infrastructure development is carried out to make sure that development reaches that particular area. So infrastructure is equal to development, but infrastructure should not be equal to disaster risk. For that, we'll have to follow these approaches. Okay, so that way you can write the answer. You can talk about Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity, Global Biodiversity Framework, right? When it came into being, right? You must be aware that it came into being in 2022 at a COP of UNCBD, COP number 15th of UNCBD, right? At that COP, Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework replaced HE Action Plan, right? So HE Action Plan has replaced this, has been replaced by Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is to make sure that the dangerous decline in biodiversity is halted and human beings are able to live in harmony with nature or with biodiversity. So that way you can introduce. And one more point you can add, that India has updated its national biodiversity strategy and action plan according to KMGBF, right? So that way you are introducing, that way you are highlighting what you are going to write in your answer, right? So you have introduced with what exactly is KMGBF. Then you have written about India's, not written, only highlighted. You just have to highlight that India has updated its national biodiversity strategy and action plan, and it has made it in sync with this particular global biodiversity framework. You have just highlighted that so that the examiner know that okay, these points are elaborated in the body part. Okay, so that way you can introduce your answer. Okay. Next now. Next is body part. Now, as question is very straightforward, the question is asking about the aim of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So you can write the aim of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, that it is about halting loss of biodiversity by 2030 and making sure that there is a recovery in biodiversity by 2050, right? So that is what is the aim of KMGBF. KMGBF का aim क्या है? It is about halting loss of biodiversity by 2030 and making sure that recovery is seen in the biodiversity by 2050. So that is the aim. Then the second part is about goals. Right. So if you have studied Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, you must be aware that there are 4 goals that are being referred under this KMGBF and 23 targets. So question is asking you about those 4 goals. So what are those 4 goals? First is protecting ecosystem integrity and halting human induced extinction. Right? Protecting ecosystem integrity and halting human induced extinction. For example, one of the target is 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 target is linked to this particular goal of protecting ecosystem integrity, right? So first is that. Secondly, second goal is about let's say ensuring that there is sustainable use of the biodiversity resources, and we values nature's contribution in our life, right? Sustainable use and valuing nature's contribution is the goal number 2, right? Then goal number 3 is about fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources as well as digital genetic information, right? So that is goal number 3. And then the goal number 4 is about implementation. In order to implement all these goals, there is a need of support. Support should be in the form of finances, support should be in the form of capacity building as well as technology transfer, right? So these are the goals that you can highlight in the body part, right? It is very straightforward. You should be aware of the goals. You should be aware of the goals, and you should also be aware of some important targets, right? 23 targets are there. It's very difficult to remember all 23, but at least some you should be aware of, right? So that way you can write goals. Then India's, the question is asking you India's, how mention India's commitments and initiatives to achieve the goals and targets of this framework, giving suitable examples. India's commitments and initiatives. So you can segregate this as well. You can firstly write about India's commitment. So we have already discussed that India has modified its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2024-2030. And this modification, this updation of National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan is as per Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, right? Why we have updated it? So that we can make sure that global commitments of India are aligned with the national aspirations of India, right? In order to align global commitments under global biodiversity framework and to make sure that they are aligned with the national developmental aspirations, we have modified National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan in 2024 for 6 years, for 6 to 7 years by 2030. Okay, so that is one important let's say commitment that we have given. And then we can write about India's initiatives. Right? So there are a number of India's initiatives that you can write which are related to, let's say, Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And the most important, you must be aware that we have amended Biological Diversity Act in year 2023, right? The original act is of 2002, but we have modified it in year 2023, right? So that is one of the most important development that we have carried out. Similarly, you can highlight that there is a network of protected areas that we have created. So with the network of protected areas, we will be able to manage our ecosystem properly, our biodiversity properly, and thus we will be able to protect biodiversity from human interventions, right? In protected areas, human activities are restricted, and it is aligned with the first goal of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, right? Then we also have, let's say, initiatives like invasive species management. India has started invasive species management, and this is aligned with one of the targets of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, because in one of the targets, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has recognized the threats that invasive species pose to biodiversity, and hence in India we have started the management of these invasive species. Then we also have initiative like National Red List Initiative. National Red List Initiative, right, which is very similar to the initiative of the IUCN's Red List, right? See, if we want to protect biodiversity, we should be aware how much biodiversity is there in different parts of India, and also what kind of let's say threatened state it is in. That kind of information we can get from this kind of initiative, and that's why this is very important initiative in order to conserve biodiversity, which is also the goal of KMGBF. Next is we also have some let's say we have given commitments at the international level. We are signatories to some international conventions, and the most important of them is Ramsar Convention. Right, through Ramsar Convention we have committed to protect wetlands. Right, then we also have started initiatives to protect vulnerable ecosystems. Example, CRZ rules 2018, wetland rules 2017. Right, so these are the rules that we have framed in order to make sure that these fragile ecosystems, coastal and wetland ecosystems are the fragile ecosystems, they are given protection. Right, so these are some of the initiatives that you can highlight. There are a number of initiatives that also can be incorporated. Right, so that is what is the body part. And then in conclusion, what we can write? In conclusion, we can highlight that, see, all this is fine, that we have committed, we have also started initiative, but what about the fourth goal, which is related to the international support? Right, so in order to implement all these things, we need international support. And this international support is obviously in the form of funds. Right, India being a developing country cannot commit its own resources for biodiversity conservation, because it needs its resources for socio-economic development, and that's why India needs some international support to make sure that biodiversity is conserved. Secondly, right, if you go through this particular commitment in the form of National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, there is one very important term that is being used, and that is the approach that we will follow henceforth is whole government, whole society approach. Right, that means in all the initiatives that government will take, biodiversity will be taken into account. Similarly, society will also be made aware that biodiversity is taken into account in the different social initiatives that is being taken by society. Right, so whole government, whole society approach will be followed in this particular approach that India has given in the form of National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Now, this has to be done in letter and spirit. So we can write here that there is a need to mainstream biodiversity. There is a need to mainstream biodiversity, and mainstreaming of biodiversity is possible only when we factor in, we give importance to biodiversity in every, let's say, process, in every project that we carry out. Right, when we carry out projects, we take into account the social impact. We also need to take into account the biodiversity impact of that particular project. That is what is referred to as mainstreaming of biodiversity. Right, so that way we can conclude. Why any developed country will provide funds? See, that is their commitment. That is their commitment. That is their commitment under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. I won't be able to explain it here, but that is the commitment that developed countries have given under United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Okay, Rutvi. Next question is, what are the challenges to solid waste management in India? So let's directly start with the answer. Right. So in this particular part, in introduction, You can use the numbers, right? And you should be aware of the numbers, right? How much solid waste is generated in India? So solid waste in India is almost 62 million tons per annum, right? And of this almost 54% is not treated or processed, right? So if this is the case, obviously there will be different challenges that we will be facing as far as solid waste management in India is concerned, right? So that way you can start your answer, or you can write one of the important observations of the Supreme Court, and that is solid waste management is a time bomb ticking over Indian cities. And why? Because of its sheer volume and lack of, let's say, participation by people in handling of solid waste, in the management of solid waste. That way you can introduce. So two options, either you can use numbers or you can use some important observations by the Supreme Court, right? So that is what is the introduction part. In the body part, we will discuss about the challenges. Right? So there are number of challenges. The most important challenge is volume. The sheer volume of solid waste that we are generating is huge. And why we are generating huge solid waste? Because we have huge population. Right? In urban areas are overcrowded. Especially urban area problem, this solid waste is. So urban areas are overcrowded. So if overcrowded urban areas are there, the volume of solid waste that we generate will also be more. Right? So that is first. Second, there is lack of source segregation. Right? If source segregation is not there, the treatment, processing of that particular waste will lead to problems. Right? So that is second problem. Third problem is related to inadequate. Third problem is related to inadequate infrastructure, right? Inadequate infrastructure. For example, for processing, we need processing units, but we unfortunately do not have those processing units, right? Similarly, there is a problem with respect to people as well, right? People consider solid waste management as the government job and they do not participate. So there has to be some behavioral change amongst people which is not there, right? So behavioral problems can also be considered as the problem. Then there is lack of enforcement, right? We do have rules where it is being said that there is a need of source segregation, but we hardly carry out source segregation. So that is also one of the problems, that enforcement of rules is not there. Okay? So all these problems that can be, let's say, written in this particular case. Fine. So that is what is the challenges that we can write. Then next part is discuss the governmental policy framework on solid waste management. Right. So next is government policy framework. Now, why this question was asked by UPSC? This can be linked to this particular part of the question. This year, in 2026, government modified solid waste management rules. Right? Solid waste management rules of 2016 were replaced with solid waste management rules of 2026. You are primarily supposed to focus on these rules, solid waste management rules of 2026. Okay. So write down more about this. For example, here there is a role of bulk waste generator, right? Role of bulk waste generators as well as extended producer responsibility is concerned is highlighted in these rules. So you will have to explain some important points related to these rules. Then you can even talk about Swachh Bharat Mission 2.0, which has a aim of garbage free cities, right? So that is also one of the initiative. Then there is Umbrella Act, and that act is the Environment Protection Act 1986, right? Environment Protection Act 1986, which is an umbrella act for the management of waste and those pollution. Then even you can refer to, at least as a passing reference, you should write about plastic waste management rules. You should refer to plastic waste management rules. 21, 22. Then e-waste management rules 2016 and 2020, 2023, right? Here you'll have to check. So these kind of rules at least you should refer to. Plastic waste management rules and e-waste management rules should be referred to. Okay, so these are the government initiatives that have been taken, and you can write them as government policy framework for the management of solid waste. Then you are supposed to discuss about the cases of Delhi and Indore. So discuss the success / failure cases of Delhi and Indore cities, highlighting the salient features of their solid waste management initiatives, right? So next part is about Indore and Delhi. So as per you, the solid waste management practices of which of these two cities is a success? Obviously Indore, right? Obviously it is a success in Indore. So what Indore has done first is, so I'll not write, I'll just discuss door to door collection, right? Door to door collection is there in Indore, and that door to door collection has to make sure that there is source segregation of waste, right? It is not merely door to door collection the way we carry out in Delhi. In Delhi also there is door to door collection, but hardly there is any source segregation. So door to door collection with source segregation. If source segregation is not found, then penalties are there in Indore, right? Penalties are there. Then in Indore they also have, let's say, processing units wherein they treat waste, right? The waste is converted into less harmful forms in the processing units. Added to that, in Indore there are plants that convert waste into energy, right? For example, they have bio CNG plants where they convert the waste into energy. And why this waste into energy is possible in Indore and why not in Delhi? Because in Indore there is source segregation, right? Similarly, there are behavioral changes that are being carried out by the municipal corporation. Municipal corporation has a dedicated department for handling of solid waste in Indore, and that department ensures that there is behavioral change as well. Then mass media, social media is being used to create awareness amongst people, right? So all these approaches have helped Indore to handle its solid waste in a better way, and hence it is a success. But on the other hand, Delhi has number of issues. First and the most important issue is the behavior of people. People, despite awareness, have not started source segregation. And if source segregation is not there, you cannot treat, you cannot process, you cannot derive energy from the waste. First problem, right? Lack of source segregation, which is linked to behavior. Secondly, we can talk about legacy waste, right? In Delhi NCR, you can go to areas like Gazipur and Okhla, where you can see the mountains of, let's say, garbage. That kind of waste which is accumulated in that area for years is referred to as legacy waste. So legacy waste is one of the issues that Delhi faces. And added to that, in Delhi, there is more, let's say, the solid waste management is more based on open dumping, right? So open dumping based solid waste management in Delhi is a problem, right? But when you write about the flaws of Delhi's solid waste management, you should also refer to some important developments in the recent past. For example, in Delhi, they have also started clearing the legacy waste, right? The legacy waste is being cleared with various techniques like, let's say, biomining. Biomining kind of techniques are being used, bioremediation techniques are being used for addressing the legacy waste. Similarly, there is also initiative that would help derive fuel from the, let's say, waste. And that kind of fuel is referred as RDF, refused derived fuel, right? So those are also the initiatives that are being taken. So Delhi is more of a failure, but it is trying to change. Indore is a success. Okay, so that way you can compare. And then in conclusion, then in conclusion, you can write that there is a need to make people a part of movement against solid waste, because the solution will not only come from the government, it is the people who will also be the part of this particular solution. Then only we can ensure that the solid waste management challenge that Indian cities face can be addressed in a proper manner. Even you can add that we should learn from international best practices, what kind of practices are being followed in those areas. Then you can even add that some of the let's say rules that led to ban on single use plastic should be enforced on the ground properly, right? So all those aspects you can write in the conclusion, because all these things will make sure that the solid waste management do not remain a challenge in India. Okay, so that is what is the answer. Next part is community participation is the cornerstone of effective management, disaster management, effective disaster management, right? So in this particular case, in introduction, you can write that community being the first responder to any disaster, the community should be disaster resilient community, right? What we need is a disaster resilient community. Why we need a disaster resilient community? Because community is a first responder to any disaster, and that's why if community is trained properly, if community is aware properly, then they will be able to handle the disaster properly, right? So if a community is a disaster resilient community, then that community will not be a liability, it will be an asset. Fine. So that way you can start your answer, right? Now in the question they are asking, analyze this statement with suitable examples from India. So community participation is the cornerstone of effective disaster management. Let's analyze it. In the body part, we will give heading that community for effective, I'm writing in short, effective DM, disaster management, right? Now if we want to make sure that community helps in effective disaster management, we'll have to make sure that community becomes a part of every stage of disaster management. Community should not come only after the occurrence of disaster, it should be a part of every stage. And if you remember that in disaster management we have different stages, right? In disaster management, if you study any disaster, in order to manage that disaster there are different stages. So in each of that stage we should have community participation. For example, so community participation should be there in mapping, right? In the mapping of disasters there should be community participation. For example, see, community is that, let's say is that kind of asset which can help us map the areas which are vulnerable to disaster. See, we are using technology for mapping. For example, satellites, drones we are using. Even ground drills, ground surveys are being carried out. But if those ground surveys are carried out with the help of community, can you imagine what would be the impact? The impact would be in a better way, right? So we will be able to map the disasters properly. So in mapping, community participation should be there because local people are more aware about the area and what kind of disaster that area is prone to, right? So that's why in mapping they should be there. Then in mitigation also community participation should be there, right? In mitigation also community participation should be there. For example, suppose you want to construct some let's say cyclone wall to protect that particular area from cyclone. You need to know where exactly you should construct that particular wall, and that can also be, let's say highlighted by the local people, that this particular area is low rise area. In this area we need a better height of the wall. Then in another area there is, let's say there is a need of relatively smaller height of wall, because this area is already, let's say, above the mean sea level, right? So that understanding can also be, let's say, given by the community, because they are more aware about the local terrain of that area, right? So that is mitigation. Then in, let's say, prevention, in prevention of this particular of the disaster, community can play an important role. For example, you want to make sure that you carry out the afforestation in a particular area for prevention of landslides. Then you should be aware of which plant species are local in that area, and that understanding you can get from community, right? Community can help you understand what kind of, let's say, plantation of species should be carried out in that area. Similarly, community can help you understand the traditional knowledge in that area, which will help you prevent the disaster. For example, in Assam, community build bamboo houses. If that understanding is being replicated in larger management of disaster, then we will be able to reduce the loss from the disaster to a significant level, right? So in prevention also we can take help of community, right? Then after prevention, the next stage can be rescue, right? And rescue primarily is carried out by the community. Why? Because community is the first responder, right? So rescue is being carried out by the community itself. For example, you can take any example. You must be aware of Balasore rail accident that happened in, I think, 2022. Balasore rail accident. So that rail accident was firstly responded by the local community, and then the, let's say, disaster force, disaster management force of Odisha, right? So rescue operations. And then finally rehabilitation and reconstruction, right? See, rehabilitation and reconstruction would be carried out by the government initially, but what after, once the government help has been withdrawn, right? Government won't be able to focus on that area for perpetuity. Government will provide help initially after the occurrence of disaster, but if we want to make sure that the reconstruction is carried out in a proper manner for a long period of time, we need local support. So in all these stages we can incorporate community's participation to make sure that disaster management do not remain mere disaster management, it becomes effective. Okay, so that is what are the aspects that can be incorporated. Analyze this statement with suitable examples from India. Now, where we have used this particular community participation, let's talk about the examples. The most important example is the management of cyclones in Odisha. Management of cyclones in Odisha, especially super cyclone of 1999. Their community played an extremely important role in the management. Secondly, Kerala floods. Kerala floods of 2018. Right, community was on the front in order to manage this particular disaster, right? Because for a certain time period during this particular flood, the government mechanism, the government machinery was unaware, unfortunately. So community was playing an important role in the initial time, at least, right? Even we can say that Chennai floods, right? I think of 2015 or 16, right? In Chennai floods of 2016, there was community that played an important role, right? For the first time, we understood what kind of role social media can play in the management of disasters in this particular Chennai flood. And thus we can say that community played an important role in the management, right? Similarly, the Wayanad landslides. Wayanad landslides of 2024 also were managed in initial times by the community, right? So all these are the examples where community has played an important role in the management of disasters. Okay? Then the next part is also discuss the challenges to community participation and measures to strengthen it, right? So next is challenges. So the major challenge with respect to community participation is lack of awareness. Often people are unaware about the handling of disasters. So that is one, about the disasters to which their area is prone to and the handling of disasters. So first challenge is awareness. Second is lack of training, right? The handling of disaster may be very raw handling, and that might not be very helpful in certain disasters, right? So second is lack of training. Then the third aspect is socio-economic compulsions. People have their own socio-economic compulsions, and that's why they are not, let's say, they are not inclined for volunteering for the management of disasters. So that is also one of the aspects. Then the mistrust that the community may have on each other, right? The section of community may have different groups, so those groups may have different let's say interests of their own, and that's why due to those, let's say, conflicting interests, there may be mistrust in the community, and that mistrust might not help in the united effort that is required for the management of disasters, right? And then there can be some, let's say, superstitions that may be there in the community, right? Community has traditional knowledge, and traditional knowledge often is associated with the mystic approach. So that kind of unscientific approach may also be followed by community for the management of disaster. So those are the challenges that we may have for the community based disaster management. Even we can add the aspects like, let's say, lack of enough means of communication, right? Community, let's say disaster has occurred in a particular area, that community is responding to the disaster, but that community is not able to communicate to the authorities. So lack of means of communication is also one of the challenge as far as community participation is concerned in disaster management. And then we are also supposed to discuss about the measures of how to overcome these challenges. So these challenges can be overcome, can be, let's say, put aside by giving proper training to people, right? Training is the most important aspect. In training we can also incorporate mock drills, right? So that people know what is the response that they are supposed to give, right? Then we can make sure that there are specialized groups amongst community, so that the response is also scientific response, right? Suppose there is a section of community, and that section of community is being trained to provide medical help. So that medical help will be more scientific medical help, and that will be devoid of, let's say, mystic approach that is followed under traditional knowledge. So that way we can make sure that the community is able to perform better role. Then we can give, let's say, some communication devices to the community in the area which is more vulnerable to the disasters, right? So we will be able to overcome this lack of communication means between the community, right? So those are the measures that we can take in order to handle the disasters properly. Lastly, conclusion. In conclusion, we can highlight that community based participation is one of the important focus areas of Sendai framework. Is one of the important focus areas of Sendai framework. And if we do so, if we allow the community to be a part of disaster management, then we will surely be able to achieve the objectives of Sendai framework, where the focus is on zero casualties, zero economic loss, and zero displacement. That we will be able to achieve if community is incorporated and is being allowed to play an important role in disaster management, to make that disaster management, or to transform that disaster management into effective disaster management. Fine. So that is about our discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.